objections here. No objections. Huh?
David, I think we should get started. Yes, okay. We did anticipate that it was going to start a little bit later. We said before 7 because we knew that it would probably kind of like this. And I think we were striving for informality as well, so inevitably that means that, you know, structural issues. Oh, sorry, well, I think you can probably hear me. So welcome everybody, thank you for coming, and I hope this will be a really interesting night. I think we've got a very, very interesting mixture of people here, that's for sure. We tried to make sure that we would invite a mixture of artists, people working in academia who have engaged with subject matter that has emerged from schizoculture over a number of years, and to do it in a, as I said, quite an informal way, so that it wouldn't in any way turn into some kind of para-academic event. We didn't want it like that, so hence the structure. I mean, we didn't want it to be a stage structure with a panel. We want people to be able to intervene at any point if they want, and to encourage a lively debate, let's say, as it progresses. And that will very much reflect the Schizo-Culture event itself, the conference itself in 1975. If any of you have read about it, or maybe seen the book already, or just the mythology that goes with it, it has been represented maybe as chaotic, but in fact it had a kind of frisson of a certain kind, I think, which was to do with the fact that you had so many different voices participating in that event. Just at that point, I think, before a lot of those theoretical issues and discourses became completely absorbed into academia. I mean, they still had this kind of energy and political vibrancy about them. And I think really we wanted to try and revisit that and see what is possible. Looking back at something like Schizo-Culture, what is possible now? Is it possible to look at some of the subject matter of Schizo-Culture and think, can we remove those arguments again, even if it's just temporarily, from academia, and reinvigorate them in some way, with some of those very, very important political issues to do with the anti-psychiatry movement, the prison reform movement, the feminist movement, all of those movements which were very much part of the original Schizo-Culture conference in '75. And I'm delighted that Sylvère is here. He's just come in from New York, so, and I was at the same event, and so was David Morris, the co-editor of the Schizo-Culture book, who's sitting here. And it was a fantastic event, quite different in some ways to what we're trying to do tonight. But so we're sort of still riding the New York Schizo-Culture wave to some extent. And it's wonderful too that the French Institute have decided to host this event. And I have to say that Sarah Frappier and Maria Doha over here have been incredibly helpful and gracious about hosting this and allowing us to be informal like this. Because I mean, inevitably when you do something in an institutional framework, you're testing the boundaries with something like this quite a lot. And we also want to thank MIT Press for sponsoring the reception here tonight. I just want to say a couple of very quick words about Sylvère, and then Sylvère will talk with David just a little bit about the work that they did on the book, on the recent publication. Sylvère, I actually met Sylvère, I have to say, for the very first time in this room. But we were supposed to film him for this film I was making called The Art of Time, and we had this room booked, and it turned out that we had to film you in one of the bedrooms because it was double booked at the time. And one of the bedrooms was actually being renovated, and people said afterwards when they saw the footage, they thought you had been filmed in a psychiatric institution, which I thought was quite ironic considering the subject matter of Schizo-Culture, that Sylvère had finally been locked up for his activities, but which might happen yet. We live in hope. Anyway, the thing about Sylvère, I think, and Schizo-Culture and how that event came about, which was quite unique, was that you always managed to elude the sort of entrapments of academia to some extent, that you were quite a mischievous figure, I think, at Columbia University. I think you might have been a thorn in their side to some extent for quite a while, because you really were testing the boundaries of academia as much as possible in a way that would not be tolerated now. And I think that this is what's interesting as well as what's happened, radicalism within academia, especially in terms of philosophy. Because, I mean, Sylvère was bringing people into the academic sphere who were absolutely considered undesirables. You were living in lofts with artists in downtown New York. You were very much mixing with artists, mixing with people who were considered quite transgressive at the time in the New York art scene. So in that sense, you know, you were mixing philosophy with this radical art form of social engagement, I suppose, which was quite unique. And you've constantly, with Semiotext as well, in setting up Semiotext, I think you've tried to keep that outsider position, you know, not being fully absorbed in any way. And hopefully we can kind of capture some of that tonight. But I might just turn over to Sylvère and David to talk a little bit about the book, what the motivation was to create this beautiful publication at this particular moment in time, albeit it is an anniversary, but you know what it means culturally to produce this book at the moment. And then we will have Susan Spengler playing some music, playing John Cage. We're absolutely delighted to have Susan here. And then it'll progress in a slightly labyrinthine format, maybe. And at any point we're open to interventions. I mean, that's the whole point of structuring something like this. So I just hope it will be a very interesting evening, and I'm just delighted that we have such a fascinating collection of people here for it. So I'll just hand over to David maybe at the moment. This is David Morris, the co-editor of the book.
Okay, so perhaps I've got quite a sore throat and my head's still in New York a little bit, and you know, I don't want to talk too much. When we were speaking on Wednesday, Sylvère, you handed me the mic and said, well, what does schizo-culture mean to you, David? And I went blank. I went completely blank because it seems like a large question. And also, as I realized during that discussion, it still doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I'm not sure that it ever will. So without further ado, perhaps we could welcome Sylvère and ask, what does schizo-culture mean to you, Sylvère?
Well, to start with, it's a double event, you know, it doubled up. And in between there are things that cost the most important, but are not recorded in what we call the book. There's the event, 1975, which was held at Columbia University. It was conceived too fast to have any sort of funding for it. So basically I had a few of my students to help, and we didn't know exactly what we were getting into. I was just back from spending a whole year in Paris. I had just been hired the year before at Columbia, and socialized and met and became friends with especially Guattari, but also Deleuze. We knew Foucault, and I knew also Jean-François Lyotard. So it was very natural to decide to bring them to the States, because no one in the States knew them except for Foucault, who had published the very latest book on discipline published, etc. And he was coming from Brazil, and I asked him to make a little stopover when I went back from Brazil, and it happened. And I guess that's how events work. It happened. Deleuze and Guattari had accepted to come. Foucault accepted because Deleuze and Guattari were there. Ardilang was touring around Boston, and I called him up and I said, look, would you like to talk with Foucault? He said, sure, I want to talk to Foucault. So he came, and without knowing exactly what was going to happen, we just asked some people, psychiatrists or kind of anti-psychiatrist, professor, Arthur Danto, who was now very well known and died not too long ago, who is a professor of philosophy. And the idea of the schizo-culture was not to just have something, an event at Columbia, but we thought it would be a small event. You know, usually lectures at university gather about 50 people. We didn't know that the 4-day event would gather about 2,000 people. And coming from various places, was friends with people from the Village Voice. They announced it was a conference on semiotics, and with the title of Semiotext, it made sense, and it was a buzzword in New York, and when there's a buzzword, people come. So Jean-Jacques Lebel, who was an inventor of a happening in France, was a friend of Félix, and he's perfectly bilingual, and he just had a show at WBI, the Radical Radio in New York, every day for the week before, and said, do come and create your own lectures, your own conference, bring people, you're going to have your workshop in the halls, everyone is welcome, anarchists, this and that. So of course we had a lot of people who followed that, and people who knew about Foucault, and also people that we didn't know were going to have other projects in mind. So basically the Schizo-Culture happened in the sense that no one was in control, right? And we had some schedule, but the schedule was tried to be respected, but it didn't happen when, for instance, when, mind you, Deleuze and Guattari didn't know a word of English, so that made it difficult. We had translators, and we had some session where the translation group was so busy quarreling or adjusting the translation to the text that most of the lecture of Jean-François Leterre had forgotten, and it turned into some sort of group discussion between the 3 or 4 translators and the audience who participated. And that was a bit a model in the introduction I wrote. That became more or less a model we had for Schizo-Culture, something that is unpredictable, but which was not, even though it happened in a very huge hall at Columbia, it had nothing to do exactly with academia. Actually, it was not very in favor of academic and academia, although I belonged there, of course. Guattari arrived and his English was very poor, and after 5 minutes he was bored with the lecture and he interrupted and he said, well, why don't you summarize your lecture in 5 minutes and let's talk? So part of the audience said, no, this guy prepared his lecture with his work, and it is true, so we want him to give a lecture. But he said, I'm in charge of the panel, I cancel the panel. So half of the room stayed in the big room, half of the other half went to a hall. We found another place, and Guattari talked, and Foucault had a paper read, and then at the end of in the middle of the lecture, someone got up who happened to have known in other days, because he was French and teaching in the same university college and was teaching 2 years before, or 3 years before, and he came up and he said, Mr. Foucault, you have been paid by the CIA, and he started giving all the facts about the committee of prisoners that proved it, and everyone was very, didn't know exactly how to react, and they rushed to Foucault at the end of the lecture or the paper, and they said, is that true, Mr. Foucault, that you paid by the CIA? And Foucault totally freaked out, and I had him on my hands in front of the sidewalk for about 4 or 5 hours, saying, it's unbearable, it is the worst thing that had ever happened to me, this audience is terrible, New York is so unwelcoming, etc. I will not come back tomorrow for the panel. And the panel was supposed to be with Rodney Lang, and Judy Clark was ex-con, represented the ex-con, and there was a representative of the ex-mental patient. And since Ronald Lang had come especially for Foucault, it was a bit of a bind. So when I arrived the next day, I didn't know if it was going to happen or not. And Deleuze and Foucault were smiling and talking to each other, and Foucault was in the best possible mood, and I just didn't understand. I hadn't slept, of course, it was the first night I didn't sleep. And Foucault was totally relaxed. We had the panel was, well, of course, very bracing. Foucault was just back from Brazil. He refused to stay there because of the tortures. Judy Clark talked about the behavioral therapy that is used on prisoners, and how we are talked about the halfway houses. The panel was going briskly, and someone else came up. It was at that time a black man, pretty corpulent, and he goes up. He was very close to the podium, and he said, Mr. Foucault, Mr. Lang, I accuse you of being part of the CIA. And And Foucault had got it part of the night, he couldn't sleep himself, but he came up and he said, of course I'm from the CIA. Lang is from the CIA, Lotringer is paid by the CIA. The only one who isn't paid by the CIA is you. You were paid by the KGB. and the whole audience burst into laughter. And so when this emissary of the Lyndon LaRouche, I heard that they were very active in London too. Apparently a group, outwardly a radical group, but in fact it was financed to disrupt all the radical meetings. And the meeting was advertised as some sort of a last counter-cultural event, and of course everyone who could be interested was there. So that was the event. So of course Lyotard talked, and Lyotard, as I said, had all these translators and became a problem. And also there was something else in the room which I noticed, but no one else could, because I was beside Deleuze, Guattari, and Foucault. And while at the end of his lecture, Lyotard turned towards them and he said, "Look, I'm so pleased you're here because now we're going to have a discussion." Right? And it so happened Lyotard was kind of abandoning the camp of Deleuze and Guattari, and he was turning towards the sophist and coming back to language, and as opposed to the flows of capitalism, etc., etc. So basically, he wanted to have a dialogue, and Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari turned on their heels and left. Right? So not only did the audience break down, but also the French team broke down. So that was a good beginning. So what happened afterwards is that they met at the Chelsea Hotel, and they all agreed how terrible this conference was. Guattari talked with a translator, talked immediately, and then after I can tell you all the incidents at work, but the gist is that he was supposed to talk after Tigress Atkinson, who is of course a very brilliant feminist, but doesn't quite like, males. And she came with a group of fans, and as soon as Guattari started talking, it didn't matter what he said, they were going to boo him down. So they pulled him out of the podium, and Guattari was very vexed. And so everyone had their grudges, and I thought that would be forgotten, that's the best thing I could do about it. And that was the event. And then in between the event was, I don't want to be too long, but the event was in rupture with what Semiotext as a semiotic group actually had done. The semiotic group was interested in as much as they refused to give language and linguistic the supremacy in semiotics, and we were trying to explore the relationship between the various other semiotic media, like the voice, signal, etc., etc. In other words, we were ready for the outward, but we didn't know we were. And the conference was some sort of a breakdown of a semiotext relation with academe, and the issue that came out 3 years later, a result from the event that was already different from the event in as much as we had things about articles about prison and madness, and we had a few of the lectures that were given and discussion that were given at the conference. But already Schizo-Culture, the magazine, approached artists downtown, and it was a great time for art. A very small group of artists were all living among themselves without any temptation to look around stock exchange. And there was I made a series of interviews for the magazine with people like Fiona Glass, Steve Reich, quite a number of people of the same caliber, but not only musicians, but people from the theater, people from music, etc. Of course, we anticipated the punk times, and we had punks also in the issue. And the issue was also made in such a way that it was called Schizo-Culture, but what we're trying to avoid is to think that schizophrenia, first, as we understand it, was an illness, it was some sort of an attempt to get rid of normality, of normal neurosis, and lead a more experimental and dangerous life. So going to extreme, if you want, extreme of daringness, but also extreme of paranoia, if you want. So just to allude to what justifies the title of Schizo-Culture. The title in my mind was not so much a reference to the Lotringer, but it was a reference to New York, which was a very extraordinary place at the time, run down, dangerous, where people felt that they were living a dangerous life, and they were very pleased to be there and taking chances, and artists didn't wait for grants to do art or to do films. Everyone was like doing what we did to organize the conference, which means work together on groups, we help each other, and so I talked to a lot of them. I published a number of interviews from artists for a reason, because artists at the time were very against intellectualism, and introducing French theory at the time was quite difficult, because they had an instant repulsion towards everything they couldn't understand. And so Semiotext helps through that, the relation between French theory and the art world, and the punk world, and the radical world. And we organized a lot of concerts downtown. Each issue became an event. So we somehow managed to bring the two sides without giving up on any of them. And as I said, I didn't want people to think that it was like a dichotomy or a split, as they usually the understanding of schizophrenia. So even the magazine is made of a series of distinct articles that sometimes switch places, or types that mimic each other, so that people were kind of a little bit lost in the issue. So they experienced a form of literary paranoia linked with schizophrenia. So the issue itself, again, was already published 3 years later during another and the most momentous event organized by Semiotext, which was the Nova Convention. Nova Convention, which Semiotext organized just to bring back William Burroughs to the place that he deserved in America. William Burroughs had participated in the event. He was just back from England, where he was in exile and returning to the States. And then I asked him if he would be willing to come, and he came. So did John Cage. Everyone knew that they were not going to be paid. The money was not a problem these days. And so for the 2 or 3 years that elapsed, I talked to Burroughs' assistant, and we tried to put together an event that would reinstate Burroughs in America, because in America, when you're successful in one decade, you don't exist in the next one. It has been at the time in the States. And the entire American avant-garde was there, from Patti Smith and Lou Anderson, the Beats, Franz Zappa, the B-52s. In all the arts were there. We had lectures, we had music, we had film, we had everything you can imagine we had downtown. We had downtown for 3 days. And after that, of course, Semiotext was completely absorbed into the downtown scene and active in the downtown scene. And unfortunately, at the end of the 70s, something started to happen, which is the change of the art world, the advent of neoliberalism, the coming of Europe to the coming of painting from Europe, which changed totally the nature of the art world, because during the 70s there was hardly any galleries, there was nothing to buy, as the galleries would say. They didn't buy conceptual work. So of course, from one day to the next, painting was created galleries to be dealt with, etc., etc. And the whole scene changed, and French theory, which we had been trying to introduce, suddenly became the rage and I published at that time Simulation by Baudrillard, which not exactly in agreement either with Deleuze and Guattari, but Simulation was just has to be read of the art world, and at that time French theory became something that everyone should have done, and should have carried under their arm around to show that they were not afraid of intellectualism. So basically we had a total reversal situation of the early 70s into a very crowded art world where the galleries and the capitalist system were being introduced at the time. And we had a simulationist school where they take Baudrillard and we created Baudrillard group, Baudrillard fans, artists, and Baudrillard, when he was invited to give lectures about, there is no simulation in school, there can't be a simulation, simulation is not a thing, what are you talking about? And immediately the news spread throughout the entire America, the art world, that Baudrillard was rejected this school, and immediately Baudrillard became a has-been. Right? So Deleuze and Guattari at the time were not yet, the books were hardly published at the time, and it took another, from the event to the mid-80s, it took, and even late 80s, it took about 10 or 15 years for them to be introduced to what I was hoping would be their country, or at least to New York. But New York itself has changed. It was something different. But the Schizo-Culture really in my mind was about New York at the time. New York was pretty much the kind of life that would capitalists both allowed, and also that was going to one extreme and then went immediately to the other extreme, which is the total absorption of the art world into the capitalist system, as we saw increasingly until today. So it was not, as you see, just an intellectual endeavor, but it was something that was untimely, that was experimental in the sense that we didn't exactly know where we were going to go, or where what we were introduced was going to go. It was very close to what Deleuze and Guattari would say. It started not at the beginning of Semiotext, but in the middle of it, and broke totally. The first editorial committee dispersed and broke down, and we had then after that a series of committees, editorial committees. Well, not really editorial committee, but was recreated in relation to what we are going to deal with. For instance, film, we had Katherine Waugh and Michael Ulrich organized film sessions, etc., etc. So it became something that constantly tried to break down with what you did before, and when we published an issue, it's Schizo-Culture issue, it was extremely popular with the art world immediately, and so we had to look for something else. We had known Schizo 2, and I realized that in America you can't have one success and have a sequel. So we canceled number 2, and we did what we had an idea. What can we do to discourage people from buying the magazine? So the following issue was an issue on polysexuality that was against the art world. The art world at the time was very prudish, and we said, okay, well, what could be shock academia? And then we said, okay, well, what could be further from those concerned with sexuality, which was politics, and I went to Italy with Felix Guattari in 1979, and saw the Italians were getting arrested and put in jail, so I went there and gathered all the Italians to contribute, and that was the political issue of Semiotext. But so the idea constantly was not to have something that would recreate itself, to always mutate itself, and always anticipate what was going to happen, and trying to stay on the side, or to change ground in order not to be recouped by the rest of the culture, quote unquote. And that's what we have.
On this idea of absorption, to bring things back to how things are now with your work that you do and with Semiotext, because I think it's worth saying that Semiotext has always been a group concern, and the idea of giving over to the group and a set of individuals working on something that's not necessarily the product of one individual. There's a central idea with what you've always done. And it's of course in the Whitney at the moment. It's one of the artists in the Whitney, so it's somehow become an individual artist in this way, represented in the Whitney Biennale in New York at the moment. And I remembered something you said to me before about your attitude towards, because you know obviously the art world has absorbed everything you do with great fervour and enthusiasm. And you described it as a kind of black hole that you stand on the edge of and usher people into. This kind of, which I thought was a powerful image, and I wondered if this is what's going on.
Part of it, you know, that Semiotext wasn't meant to last. You know, I don't like groups or movements to last. You know, the surrealists outlasted themselves, you know, by about 20 or 30 years. But what I liked was the data. The data was constantly create a machine that's going to break down. And Semiotext was supposed to be that kind of machine, right? We had that in the very first issue, dedicated to Deleuze and Guattari. We had the text I wrote on data. And what I liked about Semiotext is that it could die any time. Because since we functioned for 40 years without money, we constantly indebted to people around, right? So that we would basically, we have no way of predicting if we're going to go on or not, and actually become such a involving work that I wished over the years that it would stop. And every time I wished it would stop, then someone else would come in and then help restart the machine. You know? That was the case of Chris Krauss, with whom I lived at the time. And she started, we decided when French theory became too popular in the States, we were looking also what could be, what is not, you know, publicized in the States, or what could come to the forefront. And we decided that most of the French, if not all the French theory we publish were male, then we're going to publish a new series that would be the native agent and the foreign agent coming from outside, the spies from Europe. We're going to publish the women writer who from downtown that were below mainstream and never been published. And since we were dealing with theory, on one hand we tried to have a fiction that was as risky as French theory was, and the risk was about subjectivity, you know, subjectivity, which is of course a peekaboo kind of terms in the States, because everyone is, you know, looking at their subjectivity and wondering what it is about, instead of just realizing that the subjectivity is nothing, it's just what you do and what you involve yourself. So the format used by in our book, and we started with Lynn Tillman and Kathy Acker and a whole series of writers, including of course Chris Krauss. And the idea was to publish books that were written at the first person, but without this kind of egocentrism that characterizes American culture. Instead of talking about themselves, they were opening themselves to the world and the relation to the world, and the book were not turned inward but turned outward, which is exactly what we were trying with the philosophy. So that became another series of Semiotext, and Semiotext veered in another direction after that. Also, we stopped publishing issues, because as soon as the art world and the French theory started to be popular, then we tried to avoid theory, right? So we broke down the issue, we stopped the issue and started a series of books, because in order to have a magazine you need to be in symbiosis with your audience, and that's what we had in the 70s. As soon as the audience became more impersonal, then we started publishing books which last longer on the shelf, and also don't have the same relationship with the audience. In Europe, at the end of the 90s and early 2000, I met the third of Semiotext with Hedi El Khalti, who is Moroccan French and gay. And then we had a group where we represented all the possible issues. We had French theory, we had philosophy, we had fiction and the other form of feminism, not the one that was going to be co-opted, but coming back from the incandescent, time over that feminism was putting everything into question. And then with Eddie, we had someone who not only was an accountant and a designer, and designed the issue, but also started a magazine called Animal Shelter, which is a bit like this evening, where things that don't coexist. And also we started introducing first a book from a gay writer from Morocco, etc. So what I'm saying is that in order to launch yourself in an enterprise like that, you have to know that it's not going to persevere, or if it perseveres, it might be co-opted, and that's what we try to avoid, but not in a negative way. It's like seeing exactly what you don't want, and it's very important to see what you don't want, and not you don't take a stock on what you want, but somehow you constantly have to get some sort of edge, right? And be ahead of your audience rather than trying to please the audience. So as I said, what was important for me in Semiotext that I wanted to finish with it. I hardly had time for 40 years to write something continuous, and I would have welcomed the fact that it died. So since if you're not afraid of dying, then you're free to do what you want. You see, because fear, neurosis, etc., is exactly at all levels what we turn human life into. And if you realize that you're going to be dead one time, and maybe you should do something with your life, instead of just waiting for others to tell you who you are, then maybe you can do something with it, right? And make sure that it doesn't fall within ready-made tracks, that you create your own tracks. And if the tracks are interrupted, that's what tracks do sometimes when there's a train accident, right? Some other train will generate
collide
and go someplace.
Give what you do. So is it Susan now?
Yeah, we might just try and change the rhythm a little bit at the moment, because this is what we really need to do, to constantly fluctuate the rhythm, and get Susan to play some music. I think the idea was really this evening that rather than just have a discussion on schizo-culture that would dissolve it into some kind of representational logic, that we would invite people to respond in a non-discursive way in some form. And so a number of people have been asked to contribute in some way and to kind of test their own boundaries and specialities as well, and to do something a little bit more experimental. And Susan, as I said, is an artist as well. She's a wonderful artist as well as being a renowned cage performer. So we're delighted to have her here.